In 1962, a woman opened a locked trunk in her South Carolina attic and discovered her family's darkest secret. Inside were leather-bound ledgers filled with names, dates, and calculations. At first, she thought they were ordinary plantation records. Then she read closer. Hannah, bred to eldest son Thomas, male child delivered, future value Thurs 200. Sarah, second breeding successful father, middle son Samuel, healthy female. Premium stock, family breeding program, year 512 new births, profit increase 340% over slave purchase costs. These weren't livestock records, they were human beings. And the breeders weren't just the plantation owner, it was his entire family, his wife, all 5 of their children, operating what neighboring plantations whispered about as the Jessup breeding operation. For 30 years, from 1835 to 1865, the Jessup family of Wilkinson County, Mississippi, ran a systematic program where the father, mother, and every single one of their children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, were forced to participate in breeding enslaved people like cattle. The parents designed it. The children were raised from birth to accept it as normal, as their duty. What makes this story uniquely horrifying isn't just what happened, it's how an entire family convinced themselves they were being good Christians and smart business people, while committing rape as a family enterprise. This is the story of how ordinary evil works, how entire families can be poisoned by a system, and how 30 years of documented horror was deliberately buried until one trunk in one attic revealed the truth. Wilkinson County, Mississippi, 1835, cotton country, rich delta soil, fortunes made and lost with every harvest. The Jessup plantation sat on the furrowed 200 acres about 8 miles northeast of Woodville, the county seat. Isaiah Jessup, age 31, had purchased the land in 1829 with inheritance money from his tobacco merchant father. He was newly married to Ruth Cavendish, age 23, daughter of a South Carolina rice plantation owner. By 1835, they owned 42 enslaved people, enough to mark them as wealthy, but not among the county's largest operations. To every observer, they seemed like a typical plantation family. They attended church every Sunday. Isaiah served on the county agricultural board. Ruth hosted tea parties for other plantation wives. Their children, Thomas, Samuel, Margaret, Daniel, and Elizabeth, were well-dressed, well-educated, polite. But behind closed doors, Isaiah and Ruth were having conversations that would horrify even their slave-owning neighbors. Isaiah was obsessed with a problem: the constant cost of buying new enslaved workers. Prices were climbing throughout the 1830s. A healthy adult male could cost $800 to $1,200, a massive investment. When enslaved people got too old or died, that money was lost. Ruth had grown up watching her father manage a large plantation. She understood slavery's economics as well as any man. Her father had practiced selective breeding, pairing enslaved people he considered strong to produce more workers without purchase costs. But Isaiah wanted to go further. During the winter of 1834, while Ruth was pregnant with their 3rd child, Isaiah proposed something that would define the next 30 years of their lives. What if they didn't just encourage breeding among enslaved people? What if the family directly participated? His reasoning was purely economic. Children born from these unions would be enslaved by law, following the condition of the mother. But they'd carry Jessup blood, which Isaiah believed would make them stronger, healthier, more valuable. These children could work the plantation or be sold at premium prices. In his words, would be investing in our own prosperity. Ruth didn't reject the idea. She thought about it, prayed about it, she later told her children, consulted the account books, and eventually, she agreed. But she added one condition that would make this operation uniquely monstrous. Their children would be raised knowing this was their duty. When the time came, all of them would participate. The family would operate as a unit. This wasn't born from sadism, though the results would be unspeakable. This was calculated economic planning dressed up as family duty. And once Ruth agreed, they began preparing their children for what would be expected of them. Thomas Jessup was only 3 years old when his education began. He couldn't have understood the full implications, but the lesson started early. Isaiah and Ruth spoke openly at the dinner table about enslaved people as property, as investments, as breeding stock. They used the same language they used for horses and cattle. Thomas heard this from his earliest memories. It became his normal. By age 8, Thomas understood what would be expected of him when he came of age. His father explained it during walks around the plantation. You'll help grow our workforce, son. It's your duty. It's what makes you a man. Samuel received the same education. So did Daniel. The girls, Margaret and Elizabeth, were taught differently, but toward the same end. Ruth explained that bearing children was a woman's purpose, and bearing children who increased family wealth was the highest purpose. She taught them that enslaved women were beneath them in every way, that using them for family benefit was no different than using them to cook meals or wash clothes. They were tools, resources. The children grew up isolated, few friends outside the family. Their tutor, Charles Whitfield, taught them reading and mathematics, but never challenged their parents' worldview. By the time Thomas turned 14 in 1845, he was already managing sections of the plantation, learning to evaluate enslaved workers the way farmers evaluate livestock. The Jessup children didn't question what they were taught because they knew nothing else. No outside perspective, no contrary voice. The Presbyterian minister who visited saw only a prosperous, well-ordered household, and then came the night everything began. May 1848, Thomas turned 17. Isaiah called him into the study after dinner. Ruth sat in the corner. Thomas sat across from his father's desk. Isaiah explained that Thomas was now a man. It was time to fulfill his duty. A young enslaved woman named Hannah, age 20, who worked in the kitchen, had been selected. She would be brought to Thomas's room that night. Thomas didn't refuse. He'd been prepared his entire life for this moment. It was expected. It was duty. Hannah became pregnant within 3 months. She gave birth to a boy in May 1849. Isaiah recorded it in his ledger with satisfaction, property of Jessup Plantation. Estimated future value at maturity Thurs 200. Hannah was returned to kitchen work within 2 weeks. The baby was taken from her and given to an elderly enslaved woman named Claudia to raise. Thomas continued his duties. Over the next 3 years, he fathered 4 more children with 3 different enslaved women. Samuel began his participation in 1850 when he turned 17. Daniel began in 1854. Margaret turned 18 in 1853. Ruth spent months preparing her psychologically for what was coming. Margaret didn't resist. She'd been taught her whole life this was normal, expected, righteous even. An enslaved man named Jacob, age 25, who worked as the plantation blacksmith, was selected by Isaiah for what he considered desirable physical characteristics: strength, health, good teeth. Jacob was brought to Margaret's room on a Saturday night in November. Margaret became pregnant, gave birth to a daughter in August 1854. Ruth insisted she continue participating. Over the next 4 years, Margaret had 3 more children, all fathered by different enslaved men selected by Isaiah. Elizabeth followed the same pattern when she turned 18 in 1857. But here's what makes the Jessup operation uniquely systematic. Isaiah treated it like agriculture. He kept meticulous records. He rotated which enslaved women were paired with his sons, to avoid overuse of any individual. He tracked menstrual cycles. He provided better food to pregnant women, not from compassion, but to ensure healthy births. He separated mothers from children at age 3, believing early separation prevented emotional bonds that might interfere with productivity. The plantation ledgers that survived are chilling. Each birth recorded with the mother's name, date, child's sex, physical characteristics, and estimated future value. Children fathered by Isaiah himself, and he did participate beginning in 1850, are marked with J direct line. By 1855, the plantation population had grown from 42 to 68 enslaved people. 26 were children under age 10, all born from the breeding program. The Jessup family wealth increased dramatically. Isaiah expanded his land holdings, built new structures. He was considered one of Wilkinson County's most successful planters. To everyone outside, the system was working perfectly, but inside, everything was breaking. Samuel Jessup started drinking heavily by 1852. By 1855, he was drunk most afternoons, disappearing for days, avoiding eye contact with everyone. He functioned, but barely. Margaret, after the birth of her 4th child in 1857, began experiencing what Ruth called melancholic episodes. She locked herself in her room for days, refusing meals, speaking to no one. Ruth treated it as female weakness requiring discipline, not as the trauma response it was. Margaret was not permitted to stop. She had a 5th child in 1859. The enslaved community was reaching a breaking point too. The children born from the program were growing old enough to understand their parentage. By 1857, some were 8 or 9 years old enough to notice they looked different, had lighter skin, different hair texture. The older enslaved people told them the truth, quietly, after dark. This created an atmosphere of rage that even Isaiah's brutal discipline couldn't suppress. In February 1859, 3 enslaved women, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, all victims of the breeding program who'd each borne multiple children, attempted to escape. They made it 6 miles before being tracked down with dogs. They were brought back in chains. Isaiah ordered a public punishment. Every enslaved person was required to watch as the 3 women were whipped, 10 lashes each, tied to posts in the yard. Isaiah stood before the assembled people and gave a speech about ingratitude and theft of property, for they were stealing themselves. Samuel witnessed the whipping from his bedroom window. Drunk, watching women he'd been forced to rape being punished for trying to escape. That evening, he confronted his father. The argument was loud enough to be heard throughout the house. Samuel accused Isaiah of cruelty, of creating horror, of destroying everyone it touched, including his own children. Isaiah responded with cold fury. He called Samuel weak, ungrateful, a disappointment. He said if Samuel couldn't fulfill his duties, he'd be cut off from the family entirely. Samuel shouted that he'd rather be cut off than continue. Isaiah struck him, knocked him to the floor. Samuel left that night, took a horse and rode toward Natchez. He never returned. Margaret became pregnant again in April 1859, her sixth pregnancy. Her psychological state had deteriorated so severely that Ruth worried she might not survive childbirth. Margaret barely ate, spent hours staring out windows, flinched when anyone approached. She went into labor in late July. The birth was difficult, prolonged. Margaret screamed for hours. The baby finally came, a boy. Margaret held him for perhaps 30 seconds before losing consciousness. She never woke up. She died 2 hours later from blood loss and complications. Margaret's death struck the family in ways previous suffering hadn't. She was one of their own, a white woman, a daughter. Her death couldn't be dismissed. Ruth collapsed in grief. Thomas and Daniel stood in shocked silence. Isaiah retreated to his study. The funeral was held 3 days later. The Presbyterian minister gave a eulogy about God's mysterious ways. Neighboring families attended and offered condolences. No one mentioned the circumstances of Margaret's pregnancy or the system that killed her. After Margaret's funeral, something shifted in Ruth. She'd been an active participant, had supervised pregnancies, had enforced rules without visible guilt. But her daughter's death broke through the psychological barriers. She began to question, quietly, only to Elizabeth, whether what they'd done was worth the cost, whether God was punishing them. But the system continued. Elizabeth, the youngest daughter, was the most thoroughly indoctrinated. She'd never known a different world. She continued her participation without hesitation. In October 1859, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, attempting to start a slave rebellion. The South panicked. Isaiah tightened security. Armed overseers patrolled constantly. The plantation became a visible prison. Then, in December, the cotton gin building caught fire, burned to the ground with significant stored cotton. Financial devastation. Isaiah found evidence the fire had been deliberately set. He ordered an investigation, demanded confessions. When no one spoke, he selected 3 men at random and had them whipped as examples. But no one confessed because everyone was guilty. A group of 7 had planned and executed the fire together. It was sabotage, active resistance. Over the following months, more incidents occurred. Tools went missing, fences were damaged, seed corn was contaminated. Each punishment only deepened the determination. Then came the Civil War, April 1861, Fort Sumter. Thomas and Daniel enlisted in Confederate regiments within weeks. Isaiah, at 53, was too old. He stayed with Ruth Elizabeth and the enslaved population of 73. Thomas was killed at Shiloh in April 1862. Daniel died of dysentery in a Virginia camp in 1863. Ruth died in her sleep in August 1864. The doctor said heart failure, but it might more accurately be called the final collapse of a woman crushed by guilt she could acknowledge but not escape. By early 1865, the plantation was collapsing. Isaiah was 67 and failing health, increasingly confused. The enslaved people were barely working, waiting for the Union Army everyone knew was coming. In April 1865, Lee surrendered. The war was over. Slavery was ended. Union troops arrived in Wilkinson County in May. An officer came to the Jessup plantation to inform Isaiah and Elizabeth that the enslaved people were now free. Isaiah, weakened by stroke, could barely comprehend. Elizabeth understood but refused to accept it. She argued with the officer, insisted the people were her property, demanded compensation. The officer explained there would be no compensation. Slavery was abolished. She needed to accept reality. The formerly enslaved people of the Jessup plantation gathered their belongings and left. Some went immediately. Others stayed for weeks, uncertain where to go. Hannah, the first woman forced into the breeding program, left with her surviving children. She walked north, eventually reaching Memphis, where she found work as a washerwoman and lived until 1889. The children fathered by the Jessup men, those who survived to see freedom, scattered. Most took names different from Jessup, wanting no association. Some became farmers on their own land, some moved to cities. A few got education and became teachers or ministers. They carried the trauma throughout their lives, but they were free. Isaiah Jessup died in October 1865. He was buried in the family cemetery. No one mourned except Elizabeth. Elizabeth tried to maintain the plantation, but it was impossible. No workforce, no money, no credit. In 1867, she sold the property for a fraction of its value and moved to Mobile, Alabama. She never married, never spoke publicly about the plantation. Died in 1891 at age 52. Samuel Jessup, the son who'd fled in 1859, survived the war working various jobs under an assumed name. He never stopped drinking. He died of liver failure in 1872. Estranged from his remaining family, the Jessup plantation was divided into separate farms by 1870. The main house, abandoned and stripped, slowly collapsed. By 1900, nothing remained but foundation stones. The children born from the breeding program and their descendants spread throughout the South and eventually across America. Most never knew the full story. The trauma was too great to speak of. The secret was buried with each generation, until that day in 1962 when a woman in Charleston opened a locked trunk in her attic. The Jessup ledgers had survived by accident, stored in a trunk that ended up with a descendant of Ruth's sister. When discovered, the descendant was shocked by what they revealed. She donated them to a university archive, where they became available to historians researching slavery's realities. Those ledgers, along with scattered letters, county records, and oral histories eventually collected from descendants, provide documentation of what occurred between 1835 and 1865. The story is documented, verifiable, and profoundly disturbing. In the 1930s, when the Federal Writers Project interviewed formerly enslaved people, several who'd lived on the Jessup plantation were recorded. Their testimonies confirmed the breeding program's existence. An elderly woman named Patience, born on the plantation in 1854, told her interviewer, Mr. Jessup, he run that place like he was God himself. He decided who born, who live, who sold away. His own children did what he said. Every one of them. We wasn't people to them. We was crops they was growing. The children born from the breeding program numbered at least 47 according to Isaiah's ledgers, though the actual number may have been higher. Of those documented, approximately 30 survived to see emancipation. Their descendants today number in the hundreds, spread across the United States. Most are unaware of their connection to the Jessup plantation or the circumstances of their ancestors' births. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed genetic links between individuals descended from the enslaved population and individuals descended from the Jessup family, providing scientific verification of what the historical records already documented. The most chilling aspect of the Jessup case isn't just what they did, it's how normal they appeared. Church members who knew them for decades described Isaiah as a devoted family man and Ruth as pious woman who read scripture daily. Business associates considered Isaiah honest, prompt in paying debts, reliable. Neighbors saw them as pillars of the community. No one intervened because no one believed intervention was necessary. The horror was hidden in plain sight, protected by slavery's legal framework and social conventions that prevented questions about what happened on a man's property. What happened on the Jessup plantation between 1835 and 1865 was legal under Mississippi law and Confederate law. That's perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. Isaiah Jessup was never charged with a crime, never investigated, never held accountable. The system gave him absolute power over the people he owned, and he used that power to create a nightmare that lasted 30 years. His family participated willingly, shaped by their upbringing into believing their actions were not just permissible, but admirable, a demonstration of business acumen and family loyalty. This is how ordinary evil works, not through monsters, but through ordinary people who construct elaborate justifications for their cruelty. Who raise their children to see horror as normal? Who attend church on Sunday and commit atrocities on Monday without seeing any contradiction? The Jessup breeding program was slavery operating exactly as designed, reducing human beings to property, stripping them of agency, exploiting them for profit, destroying them without consequence. And the children born from that program, they survived, they claimed their freedom, they built lives, they had descendants who live today, hundreds of people connected by DNA to a story that history tried to bury. Some descendants have sought each other out, creating connections across racial lines born from shared trauma. Others prefer not to know, finding the truth too painful. But the truth exists, documented in ledgers, confirmed by oral histories, verified by DNA. The Jessup family tried to breed human beings like livestock. They raised their own children to participate in systematic rape as family duty. They operated for 30 years with the full protection of law and society. And when it all collapsed, they saw themselves as victims. That's the story of the Jessup plantation. Not just what they did, but how they convinced themselves it was righteous. Remember their names, not the Jessups, who deserve no memorial, but the survivors: Hannah, Rachel, Julia, Patience, Claudia, the 47 children born into bondage who lived to see freedom, the hundreds of descendants who carry their blood and their resilience. Because history tried to lock this story in a trunk in an attic, and one woman opening that trunk in 1962 brought it into the light.